Hello and welcome to Mann's Model Moments. In today's video, I want to talk about making your own oil washes for a fraction of the price of commercially available products. This is very simple and only uses a few ingredients. I'm going to be using a cheap set of oil paints, together with some odourless white spirit. You can use regular white spirit, which is much cheaper, but this is much less offensive to use on a regular basis, so I think it's worth the slightly higher price point. The other thing you will need are some glass bottles. Here I'm using some repurposed Tamiya paint pots that I've washed out after reformatting my paints when I catalogued them all. And if you want to check out that video, if you haven't seen it before, it's linked above. If you don't have suitable pots, you can buy them for about 50p each, and I'll link those in the description below for you. Now I'm using a large set here, but you can buy whatever is right for you. From an individual colour to an even larger selection of colours, but we're probably mostly going to be using the darker colours like black, browns, orange, greens, etc. Now before I started this, I made some test pieces out of some primed plastic card, which is embossed with this brick pattern, in order to demonstrate the effect and how I arrived at my end product dilution. So here you can see I've got a number of these test pieces washed at various dilutions, as well as some Tamiya panel line accent as a benchmark. So I have neat Tamiya, 1:1 dilution, and a 1:4 dilution, just washed over, allowed to dry, and then the top half wiped over with a cotton bud. You can see the neat Tamiya does stain the surface of the brickwork, but when wiped off leaves really nice contrast between the raised and the recessed detail. The 50-50 mix stains much less on the unwiped portion, and still provides decent contrast when wiped over, whereas the 1:4 dilution has almost no staining on the unwiped area, but we're losing a lot of the contrast overall. So for an ideal wash, we probably want to go somewhere between the neat panel liner and the 50-50 dilution. Moving on to the oil wash, this first test was a 1:4 dilution of oil to thinner, and it still has a lot of the oil in the mix, and doesn't dry at all in the way we want it to, though it does leave excellent contrast when we very carefully wipe it over, though there is also staining on the raised areas. The 1:6 is still quite oily, and that makes it harder to wipe off without removing from lightly recessed areas, as has happened here. The 1:8 dilution is starting to get close to the neat Tamiya, though it's a little darker. It provides really excellent contrast between raised and recessed areas. The 1:10 dilution is closer still to the Tamiya in terms of the unwiped section, though with better contrast. You can see this wash provides really good, deep, dark pigmentation in the recesses, whilst having minimal staining overall. Actually, it's much better than the Tamiya result. The Tamiya ones really sit over here in terms of definition. The 1:20 result is still providing decent contrast between the raised and recessed areas, but it has a similar effect to the 1:6 in the shallow recesses, only here it's more from the density of pigment rather than being wiped off, as you can see when we compare it to the 1:10 dilution. Also, similar to the Tamiya 1:4 dilution, the staining on the unwiped areas is much less noticeable, so it would be suitable for an overall wash where you're not necessarily intending to wipe most of it off. So what I went for in the end was a 1:10 dilution, and this is the result of the actual mix rather than these small test dilutions, just so you can see the results from what I actually made in bulk, so you can see it works when you scale it up. So as I showed before, we have good contrast with high pigmentation in the recesses, with acceptable staining on the raised areas. So this is the solution I just showed you in its Tamiya black pot. And I know that I can achieve the 1:10 result straight from this, or I can dilute it further 1:1 for that more nuanced effect. I also did a quick test on another piece to see what the results of an unevenly applied streaking effect were, and from this you can see that whilst oils are pretty effective used in this way, you needed lower dilution to achieve very heavy sort of staining results, as the higher dilutions tend to spread that pigment through the texture of the paint. Of course, we've a lot of oil paint left, so if you want to create these effects in future, you have plenty of options. But because you're going to be using them in smaller quantities, you're probably better making these up on the fly, rather than washes which are much more universal in their application and at much higher volumes. I wanted to say a massive thank you to everybody who's subscribed to the channel. We're now on the way to 1,200 subscribers, which will date this video, I'm sure. I never thought that the channel would really grow in the way that it's grown over the past month, so thank you to everybody there. So I've done a couple of things along the way to help improve the quality of these videos for you. Firstly, I've got a new microphone. You may have noticed the quality of the audio changed about a month or so ago maybe in some of the videos. That takes a little while for them to sift through because some of the material I record was prior to that. But also I've invested in a new camera lens. So some of the quality of the zoom shots that I was doing was mainly through digital zoom, which isn't great, and also it's harder to focus in that way. So got a new Pentax lens for my DSLR, so hopefully you'll start to see the quality of those shots when I'm actually building models improve. I've also started a Patreon, so if you really want to support the channel, you can go to Patreon. I've got several levels of support there. So we have a Discord community, which will start with the Patreon. We've got some merch, we've got some stickers, mugs and t-shirts. I'll be doing raffles when we get to a certain threshold of Patreon subscribers. So it's just in its infancy, it's just literally started, brand new. So if you want to support the channel physically and materially, that is the best way to do it. That helps me continue to invest in these materials to help improve the content. And also with some of those Patreon levels will be things like voting on what videos you want to see next from a list of what I've got in the pipeline, along with things like giveaways and the higher tiers, like enabling you to actually work with me on a topic and go through that. So if there's a specific kit you want me to build, specific things you want to see, like particular weathering types, rust or whatever. So started that, we'll see where it goes. I've no particular expectations on that, and just your subscription is fantastic support. So thank you for all of that. Now, when using oils to create washes, the very first thing you want to do is get rid of as much of the oil that separates out to the top of the tube as possible. You can do that by simply wicking it away on a piece of tissue paper as I'm doing here, gently squeezing the tube just to encourage it out until you have just solid paint coming out. We're actually going to be breaking the normal structure of oil paint with our solvent so that it cures much faster than normal, so we want as little of the oil as possible in the final mix. So how do we actually go about making our 1:1 dilution? Well, the trick is that this doesn't need to be super accurate, so approximate is okay, but on your first one you want to get about a milliliter to start with as best as you can from one tube, and then you can eyeball the other colours from that. You can always add a bit more solvent if you go a bit heavy, and you've got plenty of oil paint, so there's no real problems there. For this white, I just used a plastic pipette, squeezed in the bulb before putting into the paint, and then gently squeezed the tube to help the paint flow up and be sucked up to the 1/2 mil mark, and then just repeated that process to get a mil. So when you have 1 mil of paint, you add 1 mil of thinners, and then you take an old or a cheap synthetic brush and just mix the paint in. At this stage you really want to ensure you break up all the blobs of oil paint to produce as smooth a mixture as possible to make the further dilutions easier. You can see I'm really spending some time to try to break these up and get the pigment into the solvent rather than just sitting together in these oil-rich areas. Once that's done, we can continue adding solvent 1 mil at a time to make sure we're getting a nice even wash rather than a thin wash with blobs of paint in it. Now, if you're uncertain how dilute you want to go with a particular colour, you can always pause during this process at any time and just test your wash to see where you're up to and what sort of effect you're getting, as I'm doing here. It's also fine to add multiple volumes of solvent when you've done that initial mixing. So I've completed this whitewash. You can see I've got a nice even wash here, not lumps of paint in solvent, and the trick to that really, as I said, is to take your time at the beginning getting that initial mixing step right. Of course, you can always create custom blends of your colours, and the only thing you're likely to need to resupply are your thinners. You can also add mixing balls, label your jars as I've done here, but that's all gilding the lily. You will have perfectly functional washes without those steps, but I've linked all of those materials in the video description below anyway for you. This process also works with enamel paints, which are slightly easier to use due to them also being more liquid at the start, but you'll also probably need to check the dilutions for each of those depending on the manufacturer, since these are essentially finished products which differ in their pigment composition. In any case, I hope this inspired you to make and use some oil washes of your own, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. That's all for this instalment of Mann's Model Moments. Please like, subscribe and share this video if you enjoyed it. It's the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like it. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.